Well, hi there. Welcome to another episode of the Faith Roundtable, where we interview different leaders, theologians, and leading thinkers, thought leaders of Christianity in America to try to get a sense of what we're doing in this culture and how we're going to face the challenges that are coming up now and will be coming up in the future. And I'm Josh Burtram. I'm your host, the faithful host of Faithful Politics. And it's our pleasure today to welcome onto the show Tod Bolsinger. He is the founder and principal of Sloan Leadership Incorporated, the executive director of the Dupree Center Church Leadership Institute, and associate professor of leadership formation at Fuller Seminary. He's the author of Outreach Magazine, Resource of the Year, and Pastoral Leadership, Canoeing the Mountains, and also the Christian Book Award finalist, Tempered Resilience. And we're interviewing him today about his series of shorter books called the Practicing Change series. And Todd and his wife, Beth, split their time between Pasadena, California, and Ketchum, Idaho. So thank you so much for being on the Faith Roundtable, Todd. It's great to have you.
Josh, thank you for having me. It's very nice of you.
Absolutely. So I got to say, where are you now? Are you in Idaho or are you in California?
It's a good question. I'm in California. I'll be heading to Idaho. And then next year, my wife, who's a professional artist, for the next year, we'll be living in Manhattan, New York, because she's going to be doing some work at the New York Academy of Art. And so I'll be flying out of Newark instead of LAX or Sun Valley. So
oh, my word. That's a little bit different than Idaho, huh?
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah. Yeah.
What is Idaho like this time of year? Beautiful?
Oh, it's gorgeous. It's 5 different ranges of mountains and beautiful trees and rivers running through it all. And I fly, fish, and hike and just bask in it. So I'll get a few weeks of doing that before we head to the Big Apple. So.
That's awesome. Well, that sounds amazing, actually. I'm kind of fantasizing about that right now, even as you talk about it. So I got to ask, that was an impressive bio. Written some amazing books, but I'd love to kind of hear from you. Who is Tod Bolsinger and what makes you tick? Kind of give us a sense of our audience, kind of a little bit more of your story, whatever you would like to share.
Yeah. The best way to think about me, I think, in one sense, is for 27 years, I was a pastor of a local church. Along the way, wow. I did a PhD in spiritual formation and the way in which Christian communities form faith. But I raised my children in a church community for 17 years. I'm a deep dive kind of guy. And after 27 years of doing pastoral work, I was asked to come back to Fuller Seminary, where I did my degree. I was a vice president and then a chief of one of the divisions, which is kind of like senior vice president, for 6 years, as we looked at some of the challenges of theological education and how the changing world of graduate education. And then along the way, I had done some consulting and some coaching. And then about 3 years ago, we opened Sloan Leadership. So today, I still teach at the school in the doctoral program, and I run a center that does a bunch of research. And then I have my consulting company. So I'm a little bit like a doctor who has my own medical practice, and I still teach and do research at the med school.
That's really cool. So I should have said Dr. Tod Bolsinger. I hope
really
that
okay.
You will forgive me.
Yeah, no, it's really okay. That. Almost nobody uses my honorific except for when people used to show up to invite my daughter out for a date before she was married, they had to call me Dr. Bolsinger, and almost nobody else does.
That's awesome. So, I've heard, so many great things about all of your writing, especially canoeing the mountains, the idea of trying to figure out how to adapt and to new situations where you don't know what to do. You don't have a map necessarily in front of you that's going to tell you you're kind of moving into new territory. And so, man, I'd love to hear what kind of inspired you to write these books on change, on figuring out how to deal with the ever-shifting environments that we have in ministry, but of course it's not just ministry, it's any kind of leadership. What made you feel like that was the thing and the theme that you wanted to devote so much time and so much of your life and energy to?
Well, you just nailed it. It's the ever shifting environment. Like what we started realizing was, and this has been 15 years I've been working on this problem. And it's basically really, really good leaders who have great best practices, who've been trained really, really well, have experienced the world as completely disruptive. Like the things that got us here will not take us forward. And the skill sets that many of us were trained in, even as I was trained in a really good, iconic downtown church that at its heyday had 9,000 members. When I was on their staff, they only had 4,000 members. Today they have 250 people in worship. And so you recognize we live in this really disruptive environment, and that most of what we were trained for was not how to lead, it's lead change. And so really, I wake up every single day working on one problem. How do I help faith leaders thrive as change leaders? And that has been the challenge I've taken on for the last 15 years in lots of different environments. And now I give myself full time to. And it's because I really do believe that in a changing world, there is something about the reality of the faith that is meant to adapt to a changing world. And it's meant to also hold on to kind of its core healthy DNA that it offers to the world.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm not trying to have this Sunday school answer here, but it kind of reminds me of Jesus. That's the Sunday school answer to everything. It's Jesus. At some point, you're going to get that right 50% of the time, if that's what you say. But of course, we don't have Sunday school anymore. A part of the, ever adapting change that's occurring right now. But it does make me think, Jesus came into an environment that was rife with all sorts of political issues, that people were longing for different kinds of change. And he came and he was able to incarnate and to learn how to live like we did, and yet still navigate this without sin, without this, this crazy world without sin. And really what boggles my mind is his ability to basically form in his disciples this deep change and transformation that essentially they passed on to other people, that led this church that was under increasing hostility in the world to grow and flourish, and to be able to, at some point be a viable option for the emperor, of the probably, arguably the most powerful empire in the world at that time, to take on. And it just is amazing that at the core of our faith, we have this leader that came into a world that needed change, planted the seeds of transformation, and those things took root, and then they bore amazing fruit. How do you see what, like, even the leadership lessons of Jesus, things like that, how have you been able to bring those into this current series, the Practicing Change series, and how does it help us face the unique challenges that we have today, which it feels like our world is changing at a greater pace than any other world, any other period of history, at least beforehand? See, how does the series help answer some of these questions and these challenges that we're facing?
Well, it's really interesting. If you think about Jesus, one of the most provocative statements he makes is where he talks about wine and wineskins. And he says it to the Pharisees, and his disciples hear him. And what he's really talking about is the notion that many of the things that contain that which is most precious to us have got to be willing to give way so that we can have new wine. And so for many of us, the challenge is that we were all trained for the wineskin business. We were trained for the wine, for the institution,
Yes.
for the wine bottle. And in one sense, we keep saying, hey, the Holy Spirit blesses us. We're going to have new wine that is going to make the world glad, and our institutions can't hold it the same. And for some of us, because the wineskins have just been, attacked, we think we're losing the wine also. The wine is spilling. So for me, Jesus becomes a great example of that. I think it's hard for many people to connect to Jesus in adaptive leadership because Jesus himself was so centered around doing the will of the Father and seemed to know it. I think it's a better illustration for me. The two people I use biblically are, one is Moses, who had to actually take a people to the promised land, who resisted him every step of the way, right?
Yes.
They literally wanted to go back to slavery half the time, right? He had to lead those people into a vision that in one sense they were resisting, and it required massive change. Like, literally think about this. The people who came out of slavery never made it to the promised land, but Israel did. Right?
Yes.
And the other example to me is Paul. I tell leaders all the time, Paul had to rethink and help people get a sense for what it meant that this monotheistic faith actually was a triune experience of the presence of the holy God present with us. So that was embodied in a community of people, and it showed up in lots of different forms. And I tell people all the time when I consult with them, my goal is not just to help your church survive. Paul's churches did not survive, but we're here. It's really about how we lead the people of faith forward to be the container of the power of the gospel, the presence of the Spirit, into a new environment that continually changes. And it will be resisted, just like Moses experienced, just like Paul experienced. It will be resisted by the very people who we are trying to lead. The two leaders behind this, the two thinkers behind this are Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky. They both came out of Harvard. They wrote on adaptive leadership, which is what this is called. And they wrote their famous line about leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. And that's basically what we're training people to do. How to keep moving people through the transformation needed to carry out the mission that God has given when they resist it and when they struggle.
So I got to ask, why can't we continue to do the same things? Like, I hear what you're saying, and I really agree with what you're saying, but what happens to organizations when they don't change, or the arguments that come, well, this worked, how do we know that it's not going to work again in the future? Like, why is it so important that we do shift and that we do watch? Because no one likes loss. I know that's one of the concepts that you talk about, when people really they just hate to lose things, and so change means loss in their life. Why is it so important that we are forcing this kind of loss in order to shift or change?
Well, the important thing is our mission. Like, so in the one sense, I tell people, if you don't have to change, don't. Oh my gosh, the change is more painful, terrible. If you can get away with doing this without changing, don't. Like, bro, for crying out loud. People, one of the phrases that comes from Heifetz and Linsky also is, people don't resist change, they resist loss. So the whole story of Canoeing the Mountains is the story of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark's Corps of Discovery that was built on a 300-year-old mental model of how the world looked, including there must be a water route that connects Europe to Asia somehow. And that means
Northwest Passage, right?
Well, so that meant what they had done is they said, since there's this massive landmass in the middle of the ocean called the North American continent, there must be a way to get through that thing with a water route. So we'll find the Northwest Passage. And they were going to canoe their way across the world into the future. And it was working great for 18 months. They worked hard, 18 months of upstream paddling. They ran into the Rocky Mountains, which were, think about this, nobody of European descent had ever seen mountains like that in North America. They didn't believe they existed. And so all of a sudden they had to grapple with the world in front of you is different than the world behind you. And you have a choice. You can either go back and be all about the fact that we want to be water people. We want to be canoe people. We're going to stay on the rivers. or you can drop the canoes and keep going. And dropping the canoes is the imagery that we often talk to people. The canoes that brought you here are not going to take you into the new terrain. And so you have a choice at this moment. Do you go back? Do you long for the glory days? Do you long for the past? Do you try to preserve the things in the past? Or do you believe that God is pulling you into the future because that's where the world is and that's where the mission of God is taking us and the Spirit of God's leading us? And that will require that you drop your canoes. And if you built these canoes with your bare hands, and if your identity is mostly as a canoer, it's a bad day. Like, you're no longer the expert water navigator. You're now just some guy who's going to carry luggage, and you're not going to paddle. You're going to walk, and you're going to be lost, and you're going to have to, and there's no map. You're going to have to find your way. So adaptive leadership starts when someone looks at you as a leader and says, so there's mountains in front of us. The world is different. What are we going to do? And you have to say, because you're a person of integrity, I don't know. And we're going to have to learn our way forward. And we're probably going to have to let go of these canoes that you love so much. Now, if you don't want to go forward, and if you want to live in the past, you can, right? But if what you really want, like if you're sitting in a church where you're getting older and older and there's no young people, or you worry about your children and your grandchildren, or if you worry about the fact that our neighborhood is really different than it used to be, and the question we have is, do we want to hunker down in our rooms, or do we want to actually fulfill the gospel's command to love our neighbors as they are? Well, then we're going to have to decide, we canoers, we explorers.
I love that. I mean, that metaphor is so powerful. So powerful. And I absolutely love it because I imagine trying to drag a canoe up a mountain.
That's exactly it. That's why do you think leaders are so exhausted today? Like, especially in the
dragging a bunch of canoes, man.
Yeah. Yeah. How many churches are just dragging a canoe filled with an organ and all the memories of when our church used to be 9,000 people? What is your problem, Pastor?
Yes.
If you would just do this and this and this, we can go back there again. And oh my gosh, that's not the world we're in today. So therefore, what does it mean to be faithful to the world we're in today? And the new books are really focused on the 4 big mistakes that really good leaders make. I mean, these are the people who know they need to go, but they're not resisting. And they're starting that process, and they're really well trusted, and they've been very competent. And yet they find themselves stumbling on these same mistakes over and over again because we were trained to keep using our old best practices as we go. So
give us those 4 kind of issues that we face. I know your books kind of the titles reflect them, but give them and maybe a brief description of them for our listeners to kind of get their mind around it conceptually.
Yes, so there's 4 different books. There's a book called How Not to Waste a Crisis, and the subtitle is Quit Trying Harder. And the first mistake that really good leaders make is they think they can outwork any problem. If I just work hard enough, we're going to get through it. And the reality is, good leaders are hard workers. I have never met a good leader who wasn't tempted to overwork. So they keep trying harder. They've got a voice in their head that says, don't just stand there, do something. And they end up just doing what they've always done in the past. And what we have to teach them is, when you're facing something that you really don't know what to do, don't just do something, stand there. And learn to identify the shift that needs to be made, the shift of values, the shift of attitudes, the shift of behaviors that are going to free you up to take the next step. And that's hard because you need to make sure that you don't shift something that's really important, that you don't lose your values, that you don't develop a bad attitude, that you don't compromise your behaviors, that there's a shift that needs to be made. And so the first mistake is leaders trying hard at the old best practices. And we want to get them to stop and teach them a way of seeing the shift before you solve the problem. The second one is the temptation to please and appease all the stakeholders. It's a book that's called The Mission Always Wins. And it's quit appeasing stakeholders. And if you think about this, you're a good leader because one of the things, if you're a good leader, you're really confident, you handle the scriptures well, and you handle people's souls well, and you run the organization well, and the budget's within, and in line, and you raise the money, and everybody loves the mission. Then all the stakeholders are excited. People say something like, our biggest donors trust you, and our oldest members are committed and are energized, and new leaders are raising up, and it's all great. Everybody's happy. The problem, however, is when you get to really difficult decisions, like dropping a canoe, the stakeholders who are invested in the canoes are going to be upset. So a huge mistake that leaders make is thinking every decision can be made with a win-win solution. We can make everybody happy. And you can't. And what we really have to learn is the mission wins. Not the leader, not the stakeholders, not the donors, not the people who've been here forever, not the new people coming in. The mission. So do we have a clear sense of what our mission is? And many organizations don't have a clear mission. They have a motto, they have a tagline. They have something that's inspiring. It's a t-shirt, it's on the mugs. And it's actually not it's not a mission for decision making. And we teach them how to do that. So those are the first two: trying harder, appeasing stakeholders.
I love that. Can I ask you a couple questions about that? So when you're talking about shifting values, like trying to identify the things that need the shifts, the canoes that need to be dropped, and I love that metaphor, so we can even stick with that. Like, what are the, so even just taking a step back, what are the mountains that you found that people in your work, that pastors, leaders in the Christian church, that these are mountains that they don't know how to navigate right now?
Yeah. Well, there's
what are the canoes that are attached to them? Yeah. Give me a couple examples, and I want to dig into the values and figuring out which values to keep and how to be careful. Go ahead.
Well, let me do it reverse for a second. I'll show you why.
Please.
The most important thing, this happens every time. We do consulting with large, universities and denominations and nonprofits and schools and churches and stuff. Almost every time, by the time someone calls our office or gets us on the website, they say, "Hey, we're ready for change. So come in and bring us a change plan." And first thing we do is disappoint them. We go, "We're going to start by talking about what will never change."
Nice.
You got to get really clear on what's never going to change. You can't lose your identity in change. So let's get clear on that. And bottom line is, most of you don't even agree on that. So what happens at the top of the Lemhi Pass between Montana and Idaho, when Lewis and Clark see the Rocky Mountains, is they got to decide, are we finding a water route? That's what we were told to do. Or is there actually a deeper value that we actually know propels us forward? And that deeper value is a value about discovering the, like Thomas Jefferson had taught Meriwether Lewis. For all of his foibles, he was a man of the Enlightenment. That was his deepest value. We could argue, I would argue, that Enlightenment values and Christian values are not the same thing. But his value was, if you can grow in knowledge, you can make the world a better place. So Meriwether Lewis, sitting right there, embodying the deepest values he was taught by his mentor, said, we proceeded on. And that meant we're dropping the canoes, and we're no longer at the core of discovery finding a water route. We are instead going to look for a water route, but what we're really doing is looking at our way to get through this mountain. And that means we're going to have to change a lot of stuff about us. And they were less a military organization and now a community collaborating. And they had to listen to somebody like a 13-year-old Native American teenage mother named Sacagawea, right? They had to learn to lead differently. Why? Because their deepest value was they were explorers, not canoers. So what we have to teach people all the time is you're going to have to shift. You're going to have to drop canoes, but you got to get clear on what not shift first and foremost. So whatever you're facing, post-Christendom world, a world where Christianity is just one of many different religions in the middle of it, a world where younger people, like it used to be, that you always could count on the fact that young people might leave the church for a while, but they'll come back when they baptize babies. And right? right? If you
No,
just
they're
start
not.
realizing, oh, Christianity isn't, the Bible's not held with the same authority. There's not the same literacy. Like, we live in a really different world. Today, one of the biggest things is many people are looking at politics and political parties as the
Yes,
chance to transform the world and give them an identity,
absolutely.
right? So in that world, that's the world in front of us. Those are all the mountains. They're different in different contexts. But in that world, you can't do what you've always done. You're going to have to learn how to reach your people through that challenge. And that means you have to get clear on what will never change, and you have to be prepared to change everything.
So, how do you get clear on
Yeah.
what will never change?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I'm sure that that's a question you get
Oh, yeah.
all the time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But and how does that start? Like, does it start as individuals and then move to corporate? Does it start from corporate, move to us as individuals that we're going to choose to adapt this thing?
Yeah.
Like, what do we do with that?
So the way to think about this is the church is a body. It's an organism. It's an organism of people. It's living and vibrant. So the DNA of an organization, of any organization, is its values. And so the first thing you got to do is get clear on its actual values, not its aspired values. When oftentimes we work with organizations and they're like, oh, good, thanks for coming in. We already have our values. We've got a great set of values. And it's like, they're really important to us. We write them on the back of everything. Everybody in the organization has a comment card. We've memorized them. They spell the word grace. We're generous and reconciling and accountable and committed and excellent. And, we have our values. I go, good. Tell me how you got your values. And they'll say, well, a group of us got together and we read a lot of books and we spent some time talking about them and we asked ourselves the question, what should we be about as an organization? What should we hold on to as the center of who we are? What should we? I said, stop. Those aren't your values. And I know because you kept saying the word should. Your actual values, what you're actually doing. And so when we consult, we have an exercise that we put people through that is completely unexpected, where we ask them to tell us core stories and talk about heroes, talk about the things that you're passing down to people, and say, those are your values, whether you know it or not. Now, how do we preserve those values? And how do we adapt those values in a healthy way? Thomas Jefferson didn't say to Meriwether Lewis, okay, the deepest value is sharing enlightenment person. Meriwether Lewis was told, find a water route. What he discovered, what he realized, though, was what he had in his heart was, no, we're not going to go now. Because the deepest part of me is exploring.
That makes a lot of sense. What happens when, like, you have these values that come out in your conversation and in this exercise, right? You're trying to hold on to the right values, but what happens if some of your values aren't good?
Yeah,
Yeah, and how do you know that they're not good? Like, how do you determine between the ones that are good and not?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that discernment so the way to put it is, think of it this way, like DNA. What is the DNA that we have to preserve? Because if we lose it, we lose our identity. And what's the DNA that we have been holding onto that is actually holding us back? So almost every family, right? If you ask this story, like, so if you think about family values, right? There are certain values that are passed down. And if you don't talk about the shoulds, you talk about what they actually are. Like I would say that my grandmother used to say, every man that she ever heard, like when my cousin was getting married, every man came home, my grandmother would either say, he's such an alcoholic. He's such an alcoholic, that guy. He just drinks, he parties, he's a bad guy. And then she'd bring home somebody else and go, oh, he's a great guy. He's a workaholic, that one. That guy just works like crazy. He's a workaholic. Well, in our family, there were two types of men. You're either a bad guy who's an alcoholic, or you're a good guy who's a workaholic. Well, let's just say for a second that we all decide we don't want to be the alcoholic. What do we end up with? A value of workaholism. So how do we turn workaholism into, we are hardworking people, but we want a healthy adaptation of that. We don't want to be addicted to work. We don't want our identity around. We need to be able to be more committed to relationships and friendships and community investment and living life in a healthy way. So we have to adapt that now. Even if we get rid of the alcoholic value, which is hard to get rid of, the workaholism needs to be adapted. What's the healthy attention of the value that defines us? So what we do a lot, I've worked with a whole bunch of organizations that have been say, hey, we've had to look at some of our racist past. I said, okay, let's spend some time talking about that. When the original leaders, people came together, what was the value they were protecting? And some of that stuff is just horrible. Okay, name it. And what are we going to discard? What part are we going to keep? And partly you have to make decisions. So I know of a church that literally said, we confronted the fact that we have a racist past. But what we wanted to keep was this was a church that was deeply embedded in this community, in this city. It was captured by some of the bad things in this city. But we're not fleeing this city. We're going to stay here and be a voice for good now. So yes, we're going to confront our racist past, but we're also going to double down on our deep commitment to our community. Okay? We're going to be salt and light in the community, rather than a reflection of the worst values of the community. Okay? That's your healthy DNA goal.
I love that. When I think about the idea of workaholism, alcoholism, right? There's some kind of intensity, some kind of need, some kind of deep drive and force that's there that is driving towards excess in either work or alcohol or, whatever it may be. And so identifying that and tapping into that, hey, there's a drive here that could be good. It could be bad. It could be used in a good way. It could be used in a bad way. But this is an important thing that we need to understand, that we are just driven to this. So how do we take this and how do we channel it in the right way, in the right means, and put the kind of boundaries that are in place so it doesn't go off the rails again. So it doesn't end up being a negative thing. And what I hear and what I envision is that when a group of people comes together, there is this collective personality that essentially emerges. And how we figure that out, how that all happens, maybe some of that is mysterious, but there's this kind of collective culture and personality that emerges, and there are certain things that just aren't going to change, and there are ways to make those values, those driving forces, be for good as opposed to for evil, right? Or to keep that things that are holding us back. And of course, part of that, it brings me to this idea of the stakeholders and how important stakeholders are, right? And how the mission has to come above everything else and everyone else's, preferences. But how do we strike that balance between the stakeholders that make things happen, that give, that serve, that are the ones that drive things forward? Because every organization is as good as the people that it has and their ability and willingness to drive and be unified. How do we work to raise the mission to a level that is inspiring for everyone to see and grab hold of, but also to know that, hey, none of us are above this mission? Like, essentially, how do you give the importance to the stakeholders that is inherently within them, their importance as people that are involved and want to do this and want to drive this forward, and also at the same time tempering and making sure they understand, like, hey, no, like, this isn't about your personal preference. This is about the mission. How do you strike that balance?
Well, I don't believe in striking balances. What I actually believe is that the mission is not about striking balance. It's about all of us asking ourselves the question, what is the most important thing for us? So the mission wins. So you say to the stakeholders the same thing you say to the boss. I mean, the leader doesn't win. Like the hardest thing isn't the stakeholders, it's the leader. The leader usually thinks, I've been chosen here, and so it's my job to break all the ties and to make all the right decisions. And I'll go, yep, oftentimes you're breaking the ties and you're making the big decisions. But if you make them based on you instead of the mission, you are failing. So when we help people write a mission statement, we help them write something. We say it is a tool and not a t-shirt. This is not a brand. There's nothing about this that's inspiring. It is a tool for decision making. And I want you to think decision connects to the word incision. You're going to use this tool to decide what you're going to cut away, what you're not going to do. So the mission that wins is a sharp tool for deciding what we're going to do. And that includes losses. So I worked with the church, and they said, and we took them through an exercise that we do. They got done. They said, the focus of our church, the center of the target, like the most center thing that is, we want a church that is about inspiring the next generation. That's what next generation. That's the center of our targets. And sure enough, somebody said, what are we going to say to the older people? That they're not important? Like, what are we going to say to this generation? And so pretty soon they were having this conversation. They were like, well, let's change it from next generation to every generation or all the generations. And finally I looked at them and said, you are making the tool duller and duller and duller. What we decided from a long process is that what's really captivating, the mission, the purpose that exists, is to be a church that is about inspiring the next generation. So what do you think about that? And somebody said, our older people are going to freak. And a 68-year-old man who was in the room said, here's what I need you to know. I come to this church because I want a church that cares about my grandchildren. Any of my friends who don't care about that, they probably should find a different church to go to. That's who we are. And all of a sudden, everybody went, oh yeah, that's who we are. Now, it doesn't mean we're not going to care about those older people. Right? It doesn't mean that we're not going to care. It doesn't mean that I'm 60. It doesn't mean that that's a church that I'm not welcome. That doesn't mean that at all. It just means that I know that the mission of this group is not about whether I as a 60, it's not primarily about whether I as a 60-year-old feel comfortable here. It's really about whether I as a 60-year-old want to join their mission of seeing the church go to the next generation. And if not, there's other places to go. When we talk about this with organizations, we say your core values need to become part of what the Catholics call your charism. Here's the gift we offer the world, and it's unique, right? And in the Catholic world, it comes out of the different orders, right? So if you've ever spent time with a Benedictine or a Franciscan or a Jesuit, they're all Catholics. They're all equally committed to the Pope. They're all equally committed to Catholic doctrine. They all live out Catholic ethics. They're all Catholics. But within Catholicism, like the Benedictines' mission and charism is different than the Jesuits. If you go to a Benedictine monastery, they will welcome you into a very small room. They will offer you to spend the night. They will invite you to pray. They don't ask you if you're a Catholic. They don't ask you if you're a Christian. They just say, you're invited to prayer. We'll pray regularly. And if you stay more than a couple of days, we might ask you to do some dishes. Because what we're really about is the integration of prayer and work. If you go to a Jesuit and try to find a Jesuit monastery, they're hard to find. They don't have them. Why don't they have them? Because they're busy establishing universities and they're busy establishing social work stuff. Why? Because their charism was to be the missionaries that go anywhere into the world for the greater glory of God. And they're both Catholics, but they have different charisms. And so I think in many ways, churches all have to discover what is the gift? What's our charism? What's unique about it? And how do we live that out into change? That's the mission. Though. And when you do that, you're going to get resistance. That's what happens.
Yes.
And that's what the third book is about. How do you lead through resistance? And one of the big mistakes the leaders make is they think that when people push back on you, you've got to hold your ground and push back on them. Don't cave. You're not the leader. And the answer is actually interesting. It's not about pushing back. It's about accompanying people through the losses and pulling them. It's learning to use empathy. It's learning to say to the older folks, look, you're a stakeholder. You've been here forever. So here's the losses you're facing. I know it's hard. And here's the reality of this changing, and it's true. And I would like to accompany you through staying with us as long as you will possibly stay. And we teach people how to deal with resistance, how to be calm, connected, how to stay the course. If it's a shared conviction around our mission, we got to do it. But we're going to try to bring those people with us as long and far as we possibly can. We are not going to be callous. We're going to be more empathic. In other words, is learning how to lead with emotional intelligence rather than just with power.
So when you have this resistance that you're going to have at some level, how do you identify the resistance? Like, because I'm sure some people are going to be very vocal. Other people are not going to say anything, but they're just not going to be involved, or they're going to undermine it in maybe some other way. Or many times, right, people just withdraw their funding, or they withdraw, their participation and their presence. How do you identify the resistance before it gets to that point? And can you?
Yeah,
or is it basically you're kind of waiting until these things happen?
Well, when we work with groups, it's pretty easy. We say, okay, if you're going to go in this direction, like I was talking, that group I was talking to, that decided they were going to be about the next generation. Literally, I said, okay, you just heard this older guy. He's the most respected person in the room. He has said this is okay. If we just decide this is going to be the center of our mission statement, what's going to happen? What do we anticipate is going to happen? And immediately someone said, if we do this, we're going to have a lot of people wearing different jersey next year. They're going to leave our team. Yep. What else? We can anticipate them. We do. When you anticipate them, then what you can do is you can begin to say, let's not shut them down. Let's actually invite them into the process. Pushback leads to buy-in. One of the big fun things that Patrick Lencioni's work has talked about is that when people can push back and engage an idea, that's how they begin to buy in. So let's just name it. Let's just say to folks, right, we're coming before you. I mean, I was a young pastor who had to go to an older group of people 2 weeks after 9/11 and say to them, there are young families moving into this town, and our facilities are not adequate for it. And here's what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to tear down all your buildings, and I'm asking you to pay for it. And it's going to be a lot of disruption and a lot of debt, and it's going to be hard. And here's why. And I didn't sugarcoat it. And we had a long, robust conversation. We talk a lot about how do you have conversations where people can disagree and commit, right? How do we help you do that? But that process is what's needed, because the pushback's going to come, the resistance is going to come. And as you said, some of that resistance is just people leaving. So you should just anticipate it and name it. We coach, we tell people, you can't name it, you can't navigate. So we know it's there, name it. Just name what you anticipate and let people tell you, oh yeah, that's right. Or no, that's not quite right. Okay.
So when you have, I'm trying to just make sure I get this right in my head. When you have people that are pushing back and hey, I want to hear what they have to say, how open are we to being influenced, transformed, even changing course, whatever, adapting, adjusting to what they have to say? Otherwise, I guess it kind of feels like it then becomes, hey, I'm going to do this so that you'll feel like I'm listening to
it's patronizing. You. It's patronizing. Yeah. So the way to think about it is this is, there's two types of resistance. One resistance is the resistance of people who need to wrestle with an idea. The other is the resistance of people who just don't want to change. And
they just won't.
And they won't. They want the status quo. I tell people the status quo will not easily let go. They just don't want to change. So the folks who don't want to change, in the book Tempered Resilience that I wrote a lot about, sabotage is part of the process. Sabotage is, according to Ed Friedman, sabotage is always You make a change, and then people will sabotage you. And you're not a success as a leader until after you survive the sabotage. You survive the sabotage by getting really clear conviction, the mission, shared conviction. It's not just yours. A group of us together have gotten together and said, this is what we're about. Then you make changes, and then sabotage will come, and then you stay calm. If you lash back at them or get angry at them, it goes off the rail. You stay connected. You go closer to the people. You attend to them. You talk about their challenges. You empathize. You mean it. And you adjust based upon genuine wisdom. But you stay the course, right? Like, if this is what we're supposed to do, the way sabotage wants the status quo. The sabotage are the people in Israel who 6 weeks after the Red Sea, 6 weeks, said, slavery. They killed our children, yes, but we did have meats and onions. We could go back.
Yeah, we did. They were good.
Yeah. So the distinction, this is the discernment. This is why you don't do this by yourself, but you build a team of people who have the capacity to say, we're proceeding on. And we're proceeding on without canoes. And frankly, we hope you'll come with us. And that's the last one, So the three big things to talk about is the mistake is trying harder. That's the first one. The second one is appeasing stakeholders. And the third one is trying to eliminate all the resistance. And the fourth one is what I call trying to rely on trust. It's where you're stockpiling trust. It's like where you think, well, good leaders are trusted, and they should be, by the way. If you're not trustworthy, you're not a good leader. Right? Right. There's no transformation without trust. So if you don't have credibility and competence, and you are not a person of character and trust, it's a done deal. There's no transformation without trust. But trust is not transformation. Transformation is literally where you have to ask people who trust you deeply, I'm going to need to invest this trust in change that's going to experience this. So I'm inviting you to trust me and come with you. And it's good. Your trust is going to go down. People are going to be mad. They're going to be angry. They're going to be disappointed. They thought you were the one who was going to solve this for them so that they wouldn't have to do anything. They thought your presence would make sure their children and grandchildren would come. And you're like, no, my presence is only the beginning. We're going to have to change some stuff. And that is the last mistake, is you got to learn to invest trust in transformation, not just try to stockpile the trust that people have.
That is really good. How do you maintain trust with people during the very difficult season when you're essentially making withdrawals in that trust bank account? How do you maintain that sense of trust when you're in the midst of these withdrawals?
Yeah, that's a great question. We always say you have to keep refueling the trust account, right? So if you're just thinking of it like, I always say, think of it like a building project, right? Like, you raise all the money, you got a bunch of money in the bank, but you can't have a party and you can't have a meeting in a bank account. You got to put that into a building. As you start investing that money in the building project, the bank account goes down. It cannot get to zero. If it goes to zero, the building project stops. So how do you reinvest trust? And you reinvest trust in two ways. One is in what we call technical competence. You handle the scriptures well. You show up. You run meetings well. You handle the budget well. Everything they've authorized you to do with competence. They realize, you might make mistakes, but he corrects the mistakes. She is really excellent at running meetings. They are incredible at being able to lead us in the ways we ask them to. Competence. And the second one is you show up with relational congruence. They're the same person in different places. They care about us. They love us. They're committed to us. And competence and congruence build trust. Adaptive capacity is how you spend it wisely. And those three things, technical competence, relational congruence, and adaptive capacity, are the three parts of transformational leadership that we teach.
That's amazing. So the adaptional, as they said, capacity?
Adaptive capacity.
Adaptive capacity. So tell me a little bit more about that. What does that look like when someone has great adaptive capacity?
Yeah, so the skill set of adaptive capacity is basically this. Can you lead through learning? That's the first thing. Can you lead when you have no best practices, when you're not the expert? And that's a shift, right? That's good leaders start with their expertise. I work at a seminary. Everybody who comes to the seminary, somebody said to them, "You're the best Christian I know. You should go pro." And they go off to
Right.
professional Christian school. And when they're done, they get a Master of Divinity. Sounds like a superhero, right? And
Yes, it
they're
does.
really good at certain things. We teach them how to be trustworthy with the scriptures and how to handle people's souls well, how to be, competent, pastoral care, all that stuff. That builds trust. Really good, right? Adaptive capacity is when you have to lead people through learning rather than expertise. Adaptive capacity is how you take people through loss, and not just individuals through loss. Like, we teach people how to help individuals go through grief and pastoral care. But most of us have never learned how to take a system through grief and loss that they choose. Adaptive capacity is about learning how to lead through learning. Adaptive capacity is about naming and navigating competing values. So it's when you're able to say, look, we love our stakeholders, and our stakeholders are Todd's age. They're older, and they've been invested here and committed here. And one of our values is making sure that anybody who's been invested and committed here feels loved and cared for. But our mission also is about trying to reach people who don't know the love of Christ. And so we have competing values, and we're not going to be able to solve them with a win. We're probably have to set some priorities. And it might be 1A, or it might be 1-2, or it might be, it used to be this, and now for a while it's going to be this. But we're going to have to navigate those competing values by using our mission as the thing that wins the hand. So adaptive capacity is all about this. It's about learning how to listen to diverse voices. It's learning about how to face resistance. Adaptive capacity can work through resistance, and mostly adaptive capacity is the capacity to learn through experimenting. Like, we can do experiments that we can learn from, rather than having to have giant initiatives that we need everybody to buy into.
Yeah, I really like that. So, with our last few minutes, I would love for you to address two kind of groups of people. The first are leaders, pastors, organizational leaders, people in a home, whatever it is, that are coming into a situation where they have to lead a place that already has its own values, that already has its own history. The second are those people, entrepreneurs, church planners, newlywed couples, whatever you want to say, creating their own home, that they have to lead from the beginning.
Yeah.
How does the person from the beginning integrate these 4 lessons to quit trying harder, quit pushing back, quit relying on trust, quit appeasing stakeholders? How do we take those lessons for when we're starting? And then how do we do it when we're coming into something with a lot of history? What would be the first steps?
Well, interestingly enough, the first steps are the same either way. It's, let's get really, really clear on what is most dear to us. What are the things that we value the most? What do we cherish? What are we going to preserve no matter what? What is the most important thing? So, a brand new entrepreneur working with a group of people, a church plant, a new marriage, the first question you ask is, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? What's it about? What's it about for us? And get really clear on the fact that we have a tendency to go, yeah, me too, me too, me too. And the answer is actually not. Let's get really clear on what it is, right? Like, what is it that we really value the most? And get those 4 DNA. And that has to be nailed. What will never change? And if you're coming into an established organization, I mean, I've worked with a church that's been around. I worked with one church that they've been around for 300 years. Right?
Wow.
And I said, we have old DNA. I said, yes, you do. But let's talk to the people here and say, Why are you here? Why did you come here? What is it about this place? What does it matter to you? What's it about? And getting really clear on the DNA that defines it. I started a brand new business. Like that's AE Sloan Leadership was a brand new business. And in one sense, people would look at me and say, well, you're the founder, Todd. What's the value you want? But immediately I knew it was not just my wife and me. Now that alone, we've been married 35 years, but we don't agree. And immediately we invited someone in to be a partner with us, and she had a stake in it. And then quickly we hired our first full-time people. Well, we're still pretty small, but we actually had to sit down and say, so what are the values that we're going to hold on to? And some of them, because I'm the guy with a lot of energy, I got a pretty loud voice, but it couldn't just be about that. If it was, then it was Todd and all of his helpers and not a team that owns it together. And what we went back to is we named it after Alan Enid Sloan, who were these mentors in Mind and Best Life. And we went back and told stories about them. What was it about their lives that so inspired us that we wanted to name a company after them? And I said, here's the way when I was a young leader, how Sloan mentored me. He literally said, Enid and I are committed to you as a pastor, making sure you have a great ministry and a great life.
Wow.
Well, to me, that's our company. We want to say to any leader, you're going through change. We want you to go through that change and have a great ministry and a great life. We want you to thrive through that change. Those values, those stories begin to codify, and then you decide together, decided our company's values. And that's the way we did it together. It wasn't just a power move. It was actually a process of discernment.
And so either way, the first initial steps are the same, whether we have to get back to the basics or we're establishing the basics. It's figuring out what is most important, what are the core values that we have. I think that's awesome. What do you hope the book accomplishes, the series accomplishes? If you were to say, hey, these are the stories that are coming out where I know that this series, Practicing Change, I know it's accomplished its purpose. What would those be?
Well, when I was first asked by my publisher to write something, they were looking for something a little different than I pitched them. And what I basically said was this. I said, I had just come back from Bangkok working with this leader of a multinational corporation, a nonprofit. And I said, after talking to that leader, I said, if I was talking to that leader all the way home on the trip, and I was like, this is what they need to work on, pretty clear what it was. My vision was this. If we both landed in Los Angeles, where I lived, and she had to go on to Houston, where she lived, and she walked into the airport in LAX, into one of the stores, and she said, I need a bottle of water and some Excedrin and a protein bar. I want her to grab one of these little books because the title and the problem challenge her. She could read it on the plane in less than 2.5 hours, the flight to Houston, and she could immediately land and order 10 copies and say to her team, you're all getting these tomorrow. It's Monday. On Wednesday.
That's great.
Like I want these books to be used. They're field guides. I want to be used by leaders so that they can continue to level up their capacity to change.
I love that. I love that. So how can people get a hold of the book, and how can they follow you in your work?
Yeah. So the easiest way to do for all that is just to go to our website. It's AE Sloan Leadership, AESLOAN, AESloanLeadership.com. And if you go to AE Sloan Leadership and you click, you'll see a thing that says about the books, or you can also see the other things we do. We consult, we coach, we do workshops, we speak. I got a whole team of people working with me. It's really, really lovely. We're not massive, but we're doing some people who like from the lots of places. And so if you just go to AE Sloan Leadership and you click, you'll be able to say purchase the books. And it'll take you to the Practicing Change series.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Todd, for being on the program today. It was such a pleasure to be able to interview you and talk to you about these really challenging and really important concepts.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. Well, to our listeners and our followers, this has been Tod Bolsinger. We encourage you to go pick up his books, all of them, Canoeing the Mountains, Tempered Resilience, and this newest Practicing Change series. So check it out. And until next time, I hope you guys stay safe, and we'll see you then. Take care. God bless.